Sometimes you got to spend money to make money. And in this case, seeing that they're willing to spend $7.5 billion on a single company that does have a lot of studios and satellite companies, but still $7.5 billion on what is effectively a single acquisition, I think that means that Microsoft is preparing to drop a lot more cash to do a lot more. Hello everyone, I'm back. I just got married, went on like a little vacation after posting a 5-hour critique on The Last of Us Part 2, and I'm ready to get back into it. And of course, the first day back, Microsoft announces one of the largest acquisitions and biggest news items of the last decade with regards to gaming, so that's pretty cool. What's even cooler is it's something that I actually predicted back in the day, and I actually do have footage to prove it. Last year I made a video where I broke down some of the intricacies of Bethesda's recent decisions with regards to Fallout 76 and all the other stuff that Zenimax Media has been doing to boost profits and increase their numbers. Usually that type of thing is done, especially when it's a sharp shift from something else, and especially when it's in a private equity company that's not publicly traded. Usually it's because they're prepping to sell to some other organization. Otherwise, you could just continue treading water, going and floating down the river, doing fine. But when there's a market shift, it's usually because there's a shift in how the owners and management is thinking about the company, which is why they're prepping to sell it, or at the very least to pitch it to other investors. And this was one such situation where a lot of Bethesda Softworks' recent decisions seemed very different from how they used to behave. So there was some sort of attitudinal shift, which is why I was able to predict that they were preparing to sell, at the very least, some studios, but in the broader scheme of things, likely the entire ZeniMax company to some larger organization or group that would be able to use them in their broader portfolio, whether that would be another private equity company or a larger organization that wanted to acquire them for their own pursuits in the gaming sphere. I didn't know at the time, but seeing as how Microsoft had been struggling to find exclusives for a long time, this acquisition made a lot of sense. Now, I don't say all of this just to toot my own horn and be like, look, I predicted it and listen to me, I'm wonderful at everything that I do, blah, blah, blah. What I'm trying to say is that the gaming industry is just like any other industry within business. You can look at KPIs, or key performance indicators, and break down what a company is trying to do based on simple process of deduction. You can look at these few decisions and try to figure out why they would be behaving that way, and usually it's pretty easy to figure out as long as you think about it for 2 seconds. It's one of the reasons that I'm always frustrated with gaming journalism nowadays, because it's so reactionary, really immature and unhealthy. It's like it's stuck back in 2006. No one actually looks at the events and happenings of the industry and tries to break them down in a reasonable way. It's always knee-jerk reactions to get clicks, to rile up the fan base, make everybody freak out and get angry. I mean, even something like just the other day when they announced what the new SSDs expansions for the Xbox Series consoles are going to cost, coming in at $220. People lost their minds. Instead of being like, well, actually, it's a very high-tech device, and that's just what you have to pay if you want to expand your console. This is why the Series X might be worth a little bit more, but over time, that likely will drop in price. Instead of having a reasonable conversation like that, we've seen videos where it's titled, Xbox screws up. Xbox has blown it. They blew their ZeniMax lead that they had gained with this expansion card price tag. It's so frustrating to me to see how people kind of in my position in the YouTube sphere manipulate viewers for their own self-aggrandizement and end up doing a lot of damage to the industry and to these games that we really enjoy and love, just so that they can get a few extra clicks, which, to be honest, even if a video gets an extra 100,000 views, for a video that's 10-15 minutes long, they're probably going to pocket an extra $50, maybe. Like, is it really worth it? I would say no, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe these guys really need the $50. I don't know. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the minutia of the deal. For one, they haven't bought ZeniMax yet. They made an offer at $7.5 billion that has been accepted by the board of directors at ZeniMax Media. but the deal won't actually close until Q2 of next year. So if you're expecting a suite of exclusives to Xbox, that probably isn't going to happen till at least the end of next year, if it happens at all, which we'll talk about more in a minute. These deals are massive. You have to sort out all sorts of triple net leasing options. You have to figure out how all of these acquisitions of IPs are going to work, if you're going to keep certain infrastructure in place, or if you're going to gut it and put in your own people. It's really tough to say how all of this works out, at least at the start, which is why it takes time. But to be honest, a closing in Q2 of next year is actually way faster than I would have expected. A $7.5 billion deal usually takes multiple years to sort out. And maybe this has been going for multiple years, but that doesn't seem like, to me, a very likely possibility, simply because as recently as a few months ago, Bethesda and Zenimax were still negotiating with Sony potential exclusivity deals on some upcoming titles, which is something that's been reported recently. So to me, it seems as though this was likely a deal that they had been ruminating on. Maybe they had had some discussions, Phil Spencer and Robert Altman and a few other people had probably gone out to dinner and talked about it. But it likely only became a serious big deal in the last few months, at least in my opinion. Now, considering the amount of press attention that this acquisition got and just how big of a deal this is in the industry, I think it's put a lot of pressure on Sony to answer in some way, to respond in some capacity, because while they do have a ton of exclusive studios, they've got Naughty Dog, they've got Sony Santa Monica, they have Sony Bend, they have all of these incredible studios at their disposal that pump out some really incredible games. But ZeniMax also has a lot of very talented studios, a lot of very well-regarded developers, and some huge IP that now are under Microsoft's banner. Now, of course, I'm a reasonable human being, so I would never recommend that you go on Twitter for any reason whatsoever except to follow me, naturally. But with that being said, if you go on Twitter right now, you will see a plethora of tweet threads from Sony fans that are demanding that Sony ups their game and acquires some big current third-party studio, brings them into the fold. Because as of right now, Sony's most recent large acquisition, as far as I'm aware, was Insomniac, when they bought them out in preparation for the Spider-Man PS4 launch, which was a fantastic addition to the Sony roster. But that's one studio that does usually one game at a time, maybe 1.5 development teams prepping one game while the other team is finishing one. They don't really have the same sway or capacity that even Bethesda Game Studios has with their multiple satellite studios, or especially now Bethesda Softworks and ZeniMax. The trouble for Sony, though, is that Sony does not have the kind of money that Microsoft has. Microsoft basically prints cash, which is why they're valued at well over $1.5 trillion, at least in terms of their market cap. Just to add some context, this deal is one of 12 acquisitions that Microsoft has made, which has cost them over $1 billion in the last few years. Now, $7.5 trillion sounds like a massive amount of money, which it most definitely is. But when you're talking about a company of Microsoft's size, it's not actually that big of a deal. At the end of the last reported quarter, they had the largest amount of cash on hand with over $136 billion. So it's safe to say that we're dealing with a ridiculous amount of cash that's ready to be spent in this situation. Now, of course, Microsoft is a gigantic company and they're going to spend cash on all sorts of things, not just on their Xbox program. But it is important to note, if you study business for any amount of time, if you've ever owned a business, if you've ever had a good amount of money to your name, you'll know that cash is a terrible thing to have. Cash doesn't earn you money. It doesn't do anything for you. If you can take $136 billion in cash and turn that into something that's going to generate more revenue, that even gets a 2 to 3% return, you're going to be miles ahead of where you would have been if that cash had just been stuck on hand. Now, the important thing also to note is that when an article that you'll read online references that a company has $136 billion in cash, that's not actually like cash in a checking account or something, or a bunch of checking accounts. That's not what they mean. What they usually mean is that it's cash or cash equivalents or certificates of deposit that are able to be liquidated in a very fast time frame, usually within a month or so. So it's rarely referring to a bunch of like actual cash, which is something I saw another YouTuber reference. They're like, they must have just a gigantic safe and vault somewhere with all of this. Like, it hurts my heart. The point is that Microsoft isn't just going to leave this cash lying around. They're going to actually use it to do something because they're very smart and they know what they're doing. That's how they got $136 billion in cash on hand or cash equivalents in the first place. So what this seems like to me, and I have yet to really dig into the 10Ks or financials of Microsoft. It's a gigantic company, so it would take a long time. And even then, I'm not sure how well I could actually parse out what's going on in the inner workings of the company. That being said, it does seem like Microsoft has accumulated and pulled in a bunch of cash and cash equivalents in recent months and years in preparation likely for a few large purchases. Now, there could be expansions into new headquarters or HQs for their company, new buildings, offices, whatever you might need. That could mean that they're preparing to buy up a bunch of patents to expand some sort of technology that they're going to put into servers. That could mean that they're preparing to build more server farms to prepare for xCloud, all of which is probably true and probably happening. But what it also probably means is that Microsoft's CEO and their whole board of directors is on board with Microsoft pouring a crap ton of money into building out new business ventures for them. It's basic growth. Sometimes you got to spend money to make money. And in this case, seeing that they're willing to spend $7.5 billion on a single company that does have a lot of studios and satellite companies, but still $7.5 billion on what is effectively a single acquisition, I think that means that Microsoft is preparing to drop a lot more cash to do a lot more. Now, it's important to note that Sony just doesn't have that kind of cash on hand. In 2019, Sony took in roughly $77 billion in actual cash in terms of revenue. And in the same time frame, Microsoft took in $125 billion. Now, that seems as though it's not actually that different. Like, oh, it's only a $50 billion difference. It's not actually that big. Well, considering that that's a 67 or something percent, I don't know, it's off the dome math, like a 67% difference in revenue, that's pretty significant. And furthermore, Sony is doing a lot in terms of hardware sales. They do a lot, of course, with their consoles, but also with TVs, sound systems, all sorts of enterprise level movie and cinematic equipment, such as really high-end $30,000 color grading monitors for film production and things. They do a lot of that, whereas Microsoft is almost entirely focused on software. They're a software company that has some hardware scattered around, but they are a software company. So their profit margins tend to be a lot larger than Sony's, where they have to pay upfront for cost of goods sold and everything else that they're doing. So while it's really easy to say that Sony should just buy up a couple big companies, like, oh, Sony should just go buy Activision Blizzard, that would be great. They can't just do that, especially when you're looking at big publicly traded companies. That's not something that just happens suddenly. That's something that is talked about in the news a ton leading up to it. Of course, some of you guys might remember I made a couple videos on the Vivendi potential takeover of Ubisoft. Ubisoft is publicly traded, especially over in the European exchanges, and there was an attempt to take over Ubisoft from the outside, from this larger entertainment conglomerate, Vivendi, and Ubisoft had to try very hard to prevent that from happening. They were buying back their own stock like crazy, trying to retain a majority control, because all Vivendi had to do was go in, buy 51% of shares, or at least a controlling majority, and they would likely be set. They would own it, they'd be good to go, they would get to make all of the decisions. With a privately traded company such as Zenimax Media, at least up until recently, that's much different. You don't actually have to go through those steps. What you're doing is you're approaching those individual investors, talking with them, and negotiating prices to take over their equity in the company. Now, I do think that Sony's likely going to start digging into potential acquisitions. They're going to start looking at some other studios that they might be able to buy up. But more than likely, they're just going to try and move on from this. They're going to start talking a big game about their exclusive titles, and they're going to try to dominate with the exclusives that they already have, especially considering that I think Sony is relying on Microsoft chickening out when it comes to the exclusives and exclusivity options with titles such as Starfield and Elder Scrolls 6, likely making those cross-platform anyways, because there would be so much money on the table if they were to make it exclusive to Xbox and to PC. Which to me seems like a fair assumption, especially because Phil Spencer, the CEO of Xbox, has said many times that his interest is in giving players the ability to play games whenever, wherever, in as affordable a way as possible. He is the pro-consumer option leader when it comes to this generation of games, and I really have to applaud him because he's done an incredible job. I don't think you can criticize any of their choices recently. It's phenomenal what they're doing. Microsoft's game plan this time around is not to push TV. It's not to try and push Kinect sales. It's not even to try and acquire studios for straight exclusives. What they're going to try and do is be the end-all be-all, most affordable and effective option for your everyday gamer that's not super into the single-player narrative experiences, but rather that are interested in playing all of these cross-platform titles in the best fidelity that they can and the most effective price format that they can, and also anywhere they can. All of these Bethesda titles will likely now be put onto xCloud, where you can stream them straight to your phone, something that I actually tried recently on my Note 9. And I've got to tell you, that was pretty incredible. All you need is a Bluetooth controller. You hook it up to your Android phone. Hopefully it'll come to iPhone soon. And then you're just playing, streaming off of the cloud, and it runs fantastically well. I'm like straight up stunned that this isn't getting more attention. I think I'm going to make a video just on that. Like it's blowing my mind how well it works. Furthermore, they're going to be putting all of these games at launch onto Game Pass. That is a huge deal. The fact that you can, for $15 a month, if you have Game Pass Ultimate, have access to any AAA major release that is under Microsoft's umbrella on day one at launch, play it instantly, not have to worry about hating it after the first hour, because if you do, you just uninstall it. No big deal. You didn't have to pay anything up front. That's a very, I think, competitive value proposition compared to Sony's proposition of, we've got awesome games. Some of them are going to cost you $70 on launch day, especially if you're overseas, if you're in Australia, if you're in any of those countries. That's not $70. That's a hell of a lot more thanks to all of these currency conversion rates, especially when you're trying to deal with a digital console where people have to buy through the online store, which amazingly enough actually tends to lead to higher prices, not cheaper ones compared to the physical copies. Because at the very least, physical copies take up space. So if a store has a ton of them, they want to get rid of them. So they put them on sale. Whereas digital copies, there's no such thing. It's just whatever the developer or publisher wants to set the price as, they can set the price as. It's actually really interesting. The laws of supply and demand in a physical sense actually go out the window when it comes to digital console sales, because it just doesn't apply anymore. The supply isn't actually very important anymore at all. It's purely a matter of what the demand is that sets the price, and it kind of changes the formula a little bit. I find it really interesting. What I will say to wrap all of this up is that Microsoft, I think, really was struggling for a hot minute there. I wasn't going to get a Series X. I didn't think it was going to be worth it. I was going to just get a 3080 and my PS5 and I would be set. And when the Switch Pro launches, I was going to get that and I was going to be a happy camper and it was going to be great. But ever since they announced this Zenimax acquisition, I've got to hand it to them. I think they did a phenomenal job. I actually pre-ordered a Series X and I'm looking forward to getting it. I think that Microsoft is doing such a great job, especially putting forward a pro-consumer message. I think they deserve to be rewarded. I tend to like PlayStation exclusives more than I like the games that are accessible on Xbox, just straight up being honest with you. But I do think you've got to vote with your wallet. And in this case, I think Microsoft has been objectively the pro-consumer option. I think they've been doing a great job at giving players all of these options at an affordable price, respecting our dollar, which is just something so different from where they were last time around when the consoles were launching in 2013. Like it blows my mind, the shift that the company has gone through. I've got to applaud Phil Spencer and his team. It truly is phenomenal. They've done a great job. But I think the overall story of this launch is that it's a good time to be a gamer. It's a fantastic time to be a gamer. I think we're all very lucky to be in this industry when we are. And as long as they figure out this pre-order nonsense and get consoles in the hands of actual players, get players playing these games, I think it's going to be a pretty incredible year. And I'm looking forward to enjoying it and digging into it with all of you in the coming weeks and months. So let's do it. But those are all of my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I do want to hear. I will be reading through all of them. Also, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and follow me on Twitter if you want to get regular updates of what's going on, or if you just want to chat with me or whatever. DMs are pretty tough for me to get into. I've been flooded and I've lost track of everything, but try tweeting me, might catch my attention. But that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.